Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm told that the ambassador from Bangladesh is here. Thank you, sir, for being here. But more importantly, thank you for what your country, one of the poorest countries in the world, is doing to take care of hundreds of thousands of refugees. I'd also like to introduce the ambassador of Burma, but unfortunately I can't because that ambassador is not here. If that ambassador were here, that ambassador could find out what the world thinks of the policy of the Burmese government toward hundreds of thousands of its own citizens. A humanitarian tragedy is unfolding in Burma, which is also referred to as Myanmar. Burma's military, the Tatmadaw, moved against the Rohingya population after an August 25th attack by Rohingya militants on Burmese security forces. And nearly 500,000 Rohingya Muslim refugees have fled their homeland in the Rakhine state following Burmese military operations against them. The UN High Commission for Human Rights noted that this situation seems to be a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. Late last year, something similar occurred on a smaller scale when an estimated 60,000 to 90,000 Rohingyas fled to Bangladesh as a result of Burmese military operations that have followed an October 2016 Rohingya militant attack on border police. The vast majority of those who fled to Bangladesh, which is, as I pointed out, already impoverished and overcrowded, so the vast majority have fled there. Roughly 40,000 fled to India. Unfortunately, media reports indicate that India's border security forces are attempting to prevent Rohingya from entering India through Bangladesh amidst the ongoing exodus from Burma, including the reported use of stun guns and pepper grenades. However, I should point out that the international law is different for Bangladesh, which is the first resting place of those fleeing. Once people are in Bangladesh, they're not being oppressed, although they are not economically viable at the present time. And so whether India has an obligation to accept them from Bangladesh is subject that perhaps our witnesses can get into. The United States has led an international response to protect we've led the international response to protect Muslims in Kosovo and in Bosnia against Serb aggression. We need to play a role, along with others, in protecting the Rohingya and dealing with the humanitarian needs. And we also need to make sure that the Muslim world realizes that we are the only country to bomb a Christian nation, Serbia, for the defense of Muslims, something that is not widely focused on in the Muslim world. The administration should work to ensure that the physical needs of hundreds of thousands of refugees are provided for, secure a halt to Burmese military operations against the Rohingya, secure a safe return of the Rohingya population back to Burma, demand that Burma end decades of discrimination against the Rohingya, including addressing cases of appropriated land, citizenship rights, political representation, a lack of free movement, and economic improvements. This is especially necessary is citizenship rights. The idea that a people could live in a country generation after generation and still be called foreigners under that country's laws is simply outrageous. We are to urge the United Nations Security Council to establish a UN Security Council probe, a commission on Burmese ethnic cleansing against the Rohingya, and urge the United Nations Security Council to establish a UN-monitored safe zone for the Rohingya in Rakhine State to protect it from future mass killings. The Burmese government says it will allow the return of these refugees, catch-22, when they provide proof of nationality. But since 1982, the Burmese government has stripped the Rohingya of their citizenship making it impossible for them to prove Burmese nationality. This is outrageous. Every group of people on the earth has immigrated to where they live from somewhere else, since we all came from apparently Eastern Africa. And to say that you are not a citizen of a country because you cannot prove that your most ancient ancestors were born there would make us all citizens perhaps of Ethiopia and no citizens of any other country in the world. It is that I say that just to show how absurd the position is, to deny citizenship for people not only born in a country but whose parents and even grandparents were born in that country. The United States was closely involved in bringing democracy to Burma, a process that included elections in 2010 and 2015, the release of political prisoners, the formation of a civilian government, and the lifting of UN sanctions. The United States should also take the lead in upholding democratic practices, and democracy goes with fair treatment of minorities and a protection of minorities. It must press the Burmese government to end military operations against the Rohingya, accept the refugees back, and grant them citizenship. I think they're already legally citizens, recognize that citizenship. In September of last year, I, along with other members of this subcommittee, met with Aung San Suu Kyi as the former administration decided to lift a number of economic sanctions on Burma. It's clear after the massacres and cleansing of October 2016 and the recent actions that we need to reevaluate that policy. Last week, the State Department announced the U.S. is providing an additional $32 million in humanitarian assistance. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses whether that's sufficient, and I yield back. Particularly USAID, do we know?
I don't know the precise figure off the top of my head. I can certainly.
Can you give me a range?
Roughly about $80 million a year right now, fiscal year.
Now, so the first thing we could do is cut that. Is much of that for democracy and human rights promotion, or is it mostly economic development?
There's a combination of economic development promotion, but also we have been a significant supporter of the peace process that's underway under the terms of what is called the National Ceasefire Agreement. Bear in mind, only 8 of the roughly 22, 23 EAOs have signed that ceasefire agreement. And I will throw in that while I was
there is the slogan, no justice, no peace. The idea that we'd be giving money to the Burmese government to help it achieve its objectives. Now, human rights and democracy may not be its objectives, but anything that is consistent with it, that we'd be giving them money for that, seems absurd, especially when we're talking about doing things that would cost the U.S. taxpayer money, such as sanctions or humanitarian aid, all of which may be warranted, but we should first do the thing that reduces expenditures. I'm going to ask this question probably for the record unless somebody knows, but I hope Dr. Martin and his team at the CRS will get me an answer. What's being done to publicize to the Muslim world China's support for this murderous regime, and what's being done to publicize the fact that we are doing more to protect the Rohingya than any other state other than those in the immediate neighborhood? I don't see anyone anxious to answer that question right now, so I'll ask that for the record. Now, an uncomfortable question. Is ARSA engaging in some smaller atrocities, and given our support for the Rohingya, can we persuade them to limit their actions to those against the Burmese military? Mr. Lohman, or anyone else?
There are reports of ARSA carrying out attacks and
against civilians.
Yes,
Okay.
and of course.
And for the record, they are tiny in quantity compared to what the Rohingya people are facing. At the same time, they undermine ARSA's, well, the moral case that we are trying to make, and they also undermine the ability of the Burmese government to change its policy and become more reasonable. One atrocity against Buddhists in Rakhine State could make it difficult for those inside the Burmese government to change its policy. Let's see. Is Voice of America carrying the message that it should? Do the average person in Burma know what the world thinks of what their government is doing? Mr. Lohman, anybody know? If we don't have an answer, I'll ask for the record.
I can get you more information, sir. I know Radio Free Asia, for example, has regular stories about what's going on in Rakhine State. It's
And are
focused
those
primarily
are
on-
those in the Burmese language?
Yes, there is a Voice of America or Radio Free Asia Burmese broadcast.
One would hope that they would have the courage at the Burmese service to push these stories, not just in the, I assume we have that we also broadcast in the language of Bangladesh. And it's a lot easier for that service to cover this message. And I'll just throw this out here. If the Burmese government disenfranchises some of its people, I mean, a government has a certain amount of territory for the benefit of its people. They have disclaimed over 1 million of their people. If they permanently show that they're unwilling or unable to protect Rohingya, is a long-term solution the transfer of territory to Bangladesh. We obviously, as a nation, don't like to see sovereign borders changed, but when a nation refuses to allow its own people to live on its territory, it loses the right to control that territory. Dr. Martin.
Real quick, it's interesting you bring that up because in the early days when there was a previous insurgent group among the Rohingya, what they wanted at that time was to be part of what was Pakistan, East Pakistan.
Which is today Bangladesh.
Which
yes.
is today Bangladesh. So I do not know if ARSA and its leadership or the Rohingya people in general would want that.
Obviously, the first choice is the return of the refugees in citizenship, protection, and living in harmony with the other people of Rakhine State. But if that cannot be achieved, then a transfer of population has been achieved through this ethnic cleansing. Perhaps a transfer of territory would go along with it. For the record, I want to point out that the ambassador from Bangladesh has no comment.
Thank you, Mr.